I spent years wandering the streets of New York after returning from the Cold War, a veteran nobody remembered, dressed in a uniform that hadn't seen a battlefield in decades, folded carefully inside a backpack whose seams were worn and whose color had long since faded. I slept on benches in Central Park, under bridges in Harlem, sometimes beneath the awning of old Polish bakeries downtown that reminded me of home. I kept my memories close, like the only blanket I had left in a world that had moved on without me. And in the inside pocket of my coat, I carried a letter that I never had the courage to deliver. Not because I didn't want to, but because I no longer believed I had the right. There were nights when the cold sliced through me like barbed wire, and I would press that letter to my chest, as if the words inside could keep my heart beating. I'd close my eyes and still hear the mechanical clank of East German trains, the distant echo of boots on wet cobblestone, the muffled sound of gunfire somewhere beyond the wall. It was always raining in my memories, always grey, always quiet, like the world was waiting to wake up from a dream it never quite understood. In that fractured silence, I held onto a name I hadn't heard in years, Janek, and the last promise I ever made to someone who loved me. Her name was Helena. I met her in 1982, in a Berlin cafe that served bitter coffee and laughter that echoed louder than the fear outside. She taught me how to dream without permission, how to smile even when your city was divided by a wall you could never climb. I promised her that when the war ended, I'd come back for her, that I'd find her wherever she was and bring her home with me, wherever that might be. But when I finally returned, everything had changed. The address she gave me no longer existed. A neighbor told me she had left, married someone else, believing I had died on the front lines, buried beneath snow and silence. And I couldn't blame her. I just disappeared. It was easier that way, to vanish between the cracks, to live as a ghost in a city that no longer knew my face. I walked for years without speaking my name, without hearing it, and yet every time I unfolded that letter, I remembered who I was. Not just a soldier, not just a stranger, but a man who had once been loved, fiercely, fully, by someone who had waited for as long as her heart would allow. If this story is touching you the way it touched me, to write it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep sharing stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. I remember the way January nights could slice through skin like glass, how the wind would rush between the buildings and carry the scent of garbage and roasted chestnuts in the same breath, how the leaves in Central Park would scrape along the pavement like dry whispers, telling secrets only I seemed to hear. Each night was a battlefield in its own right, not because of bullets or borders, but because I had to fight to remember who I was, to stay anchored to a reality that seemed determined to forget I ever existed. I sat alone on benches slick with ice, my coat pulled tight, hands stuffed into the same pockets that once held maps and orders, now filled with lint and the folded corners of a letter that aged as I did. In my mind, the city became a landscape of trenches, the subway tunnels, the alleyways, the shadows under scaffolding, each a place where I relived the sounds and silences of a war that had never truly ended for me. Sometimes I'd walk aimlessly through Riverside Park, tracing the same route I imagined Helena might take, though I had no real reason to believe she was ever here. But I liked to pretend. Pretending kept me from sinking too deep into the guilt and shame I carried like shrapnel lodged beneath the surface. I'd pass by lit windows and wonder if she was behind one of them, her silhouette cast against a kitchen wall, her hands stirring a pot of soup, while her husband read the paper and her children laughed in a room I would never see. I imagined the warmth inside, and I'd grip the letter tighter, as if it could draw heat through the paper, as if the ink could somehow burn with all the words I never spoke. I knew I had no right to miss her after disappearing. I knew I should have knocked on that door. But when I stood on that street again, outside the building where we once dreamed of a shared future, I froze, not from the cold, but from the weight of everything I had failed to become. Every corner of this city has become stained with a memory, A fight in Queens that reminded me of Dresden, a siren in the Bronx that pulled me back to the border patrols near Leipzig, the way the lights on the East River looked too much like the flash of distant mortars. I could never escape it. I carried the war inside me like an infection, something invisible and persistent. People think the fighting ends when the weapons fall silent, but they don't see the battles that continue behind the eyes, the ones that play on loop in quiet moments when you least expect them. I once saw a boy drop a toy on the sidewalk and cry, and for a moment I was 22 again, standing over the body of a friend who had stepped on a mine, his last words tangled in a language I still dream in. There were days I wished someone would ask me my name, not out of pity, but out of genuine curiosity, as if I were still a man and not just part of the scenery. I watched people rush by, their coats clean, their shoes dry, their lives moving forward, while mine remained stuck in a moment I could never undo. Some nights, when I found a quiet spot under a bridge or in the corner of a subway platform, I'd pull out the letter and read it aloud to no one. "Dear Helena," it always began, and I'd pause there because even that felt like too much, too raw, too exposed. I wrote it on a train back from Dresden, my hands shaking, my heart still pounding from the mission we'd just survived. I told her I was coming back, that I never stopped thinking of her, that she was the only light that kept me sane in all that madness. I folded the letter with the hope that it would carry me home, and maybe it did, but I didn't recognize the place when I arrived. I suppose there's something poetic in being lost in a city of millions, in becoming invisible beneath neon signs and steam rising from manhole covers, in walking past the same buskers and vendors who never once looked me in the eye. It's easier that way, to be nobody, to let the cold decide when you move, where you sleep, what you dream. There's a kind of peace in surrender, even if it's built from ashes. Still, every now and then, I'd see a woman with grey in her hair, wearing a scarf like the one Helena used to wear, and my chest would tighten, as if time had folded in on itself, and I was that young man again, waiting outside a cafe in Berlin, clutching a flower he couldn't afford and a future he didn't deserve. There were nights when I'd wake up in a panic, heart racing, lungs grasping for air that didn't seem to come. Not because of any real danger, but because my mind had dragged me back to the edge of a nightmare I could never leave behind. The dreams always began the same way. The rhythmic hum of a train beneath my feet, the metal groaning with each bend in the tracks, the cold window against my forehead, blurring the snow-covered landscape outside. I'd written the letter on that train, folded against the corner of an iron seat, knees pulled up to my chest, a pen trembling between my fingers like a soldier too tired to hold his weapon. "Dear Helena," I wrote, "I'm coming home. I kept my promise. I'm alive." I remember looking down at my hands after writing that line, the scars still fresh from the last deployment, my knuckles raw from the cold, my palms calloused in places I didn't recognize. There was dirt under my fingernails and blood in the creases of my skin that soap alone couldn't wash away. But I felt hopeful. Terrified, yes, but hopeful. Like maybe, just maybe, everything we dreamed could still be waiting at the other end of that train ride. I imagined her waiting for me at the platform, wrapped in that grey wool coat she used to wear, a book in her hand, her breath visible in the air as she searched the crowd for a face she hadn't seen in years. That image kept me alive through too many nights to count, but when I stepped off the train in Warsaw, something felt wrong. Not just the buildings, though they had changed, or the people, though they seemed more rushed, more tired. It was something deeper, like I had crossed into a world where I no longer belonged. I walked to her street on instinct, not stopping for food or rest, just letting my feet carry me through neighborhoods that looked familiar and foreign all at once. I found her building, or what was left of it. The number was gone, the mailbox broken, the paint on the door peeling in long, sad strips. A neighbor, older, with eyes that had seen too much, told me she'd moved away years ago. "Married," he said. "Thought you were dead. Had to move on." And just like that, everything I had held on to vanished. I could have asked for more details. I could have found her. I had the name of the town she might have gone to, a phone number scrawled on the back of an old photograph, but I didn't use it. I stood in the snow until my feet went numb, until the wind peeled the tears off my face, until I no longer remembered what I had expected to find. I turned around and walked away, not because I wanted to, but because I knew, in that moment, that I had waited too long and that some doors once closed should never be knocked on again. I started drifting after that, through cities, through years, through layers of myself I didn't recognize anymore. I stopped answering questions, stopped asking them. I became just another man in the margins, surviving off what people didn't finish, sleeping where no one would see me, speaking only when absolutely necessary. It was easier to be forgotten than to face the echo of her name. Because every time I tried to say it, my throat closed. Every time I saw someone resembling her, my heart betrayed me, leapt forward only to land in the same emptiness. The letter stayed with me, though, always. It outlived the soles of my boots, the lining of my coat, even the smell of cigarettes I used to cover the stench of unwashed skin. I never mailed it. I couldn't. Not after learning she'd moved on. But throwing it away felt like throwing away a part of myself, the part that had once believed in something more than survival. So I kept it close, unfolded it on quiet nights, read it to the stars or the rats or the ghosts of soldiers who shared my bench. Sometimes I imagined she could hear it, that the wind would carry my words across oceans, over rooftops, under locked windows, into her dreams. It's strange how the world can move so fast and still leave people behind. I saw technology transform everything. Phones that fit in your pocket, cars that didn't need drivers, screens that knew your name. But no one ever looked at me long enough to wonder what mine was. I was just another man sleeping under the hum of street lamps, my story hidden in creases and crumbs. And maybe I deserved that. Maybe disappearing was my punishment for not being brave enough to face her new life, to say, "I'm sorry I was late," and mean it. But part of me still wondered every day, what if I had knocked on her door? What if I had mailed the letter? What if the words I wrote on that train had made it into her hands instead of rotting in my coat pocket for decades? What if I had let myself be seen? The years blurred together like rain on a windshield. Each one indistinguishable from the last, each day folded into the next, until time stopped feeling linear and became more like a circle I was condemned to walk around forever. I watched neighborhoods rise and fall. I saw buildings change hands, cafes close down, parks fill with new benches and different trees, as if the city were trying to forget everything that came before. But me, I didn't change. I was still the man on the bench. The man people passed without seeing, the man no one ever asked about. I remember watching a boy grow up from afar. He and his father used to walk through Tompkins Square every Sunday morning. The boy would run ahead, pretend the pigeons were enemy soldiers, shouting orders in a voice too young to know war. I saw that boy become a teenager, then a man. One morning he walked the park alone, slower now, hands in pockets, head bowed, just like his father used to. And I sat on the same bench, watching, as if time were a loop I couldn't escape. That's how I knew how many years had passed. Not from my reflection in windows, which I rarely looked at, but from the lives I watched move forward without me. I suppose there was a kind of safety in that invisibility. No one expected anything from me, no one asked questions I didn't want to answer. But the cost was high, unbearably high. I had no one to say good morning to, no one to remind me it was my birthday, no voice calling me Yannick. That name, once so familiar, so filled with meaning, had become a relic, like the medals I no longer wore and the flag I stopped saluting. Some nights I'd whisper it under my breath just to see if it still felt real. "Yannick," I'd say to the shadows, "are you still in there?" There was a moment, I can still see it clearly, when I caught my reflection in the window of a florist shop on Avenue A. I barely recognized the face staring back. My beard was white, uneven. My eyes sunk deep into hollows, my skin weathered from too many winters with no shelter. I stood there, staring, for longer than I should have, wondering if Helena would even recognize me now. Would she see the man she once loved? Or just another broken body among many? I pressed my fingers to the glass and closed my eyes, remembering her laugh, the softness of her hands, the way she used to say my name like a song. That memory was the only mirror I trusted anymore. Each night, I unfolded the letter like a ritual. The paper had gone soft at the edges, yellowed and fragile, but the words, those stayed sharp. I knew them by heart. Still, I read them aloud, sometimes just mouthing the words, afraid my voice might betray me. "Dear Helena," I'd begin, and then I'd pause, waiting for something, maybe a feeling, maybe a voice in return. But nothing ever came, just the sound of distant traffic, the rustling of rats in the trash, the breath of a city that didn't know I was still alive. One night, I was sitting on my usual bench near the museum, the one where the streetlight flickered every few seconds, like an old memory refusing to die, when I heard a boy ask his father, "Who is that man?" I felt my heart catch in my chest. The father looked at me, briefly, politely, then looked away. "Nobody," he said, and they kept walking. Nobody. I'd heard worse, I suppose, been called worse, but there was something about that word that hollowed me out like a punch. I wasn't angry. I understood. To them, I was just part of the landscape, like the squirrels, or the statue nearby, or the bench itself. Still, it stayed with me, echoing long after their footsteps faded. Nobody. Was that all I'd become? But I knew better. I remembered every detail. The way Helena's fingers trembled when she handed me the letter that I never had the chance to read. The warmth of her lips against my cheek before I boarded that last train. The way she stood there, not crying, just holding her breath, as if letting it out would shatter everything. I remembered it all. The good, the painful, the pieces that made me who I was. And that's why I kept the letter. Not because I thought I'd ever give it to her, not because I expected some kind of redemption, but because it reminded me that I had once been loved, fully, completely, by someone who saw me when the world didn't. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep going. Because when you've lived half a life in silence, sometimes the only thing louder than memory is hope. It was a spring morning, the kind that comes suddenly after a long and bitter winter, when the air carries a softness you'd forgotten was possible, when the breeze smells faintly of earth and something like forgiveness. I was sitting on the same bench I always chose, the one near the fountain in Carlschertz Park, where the river sparkled behind rusted iron fences and old couples walked their dogs in silence. I'd just finished reading the letter again, lips moving slowly, deliberately, like prayer. I folded it carefully and slipped it back into my coat, pressing it against my chest like I always did. Not because I needed to hide it, but because I needed to feel it. I was about to close my eyes when I heard a voice behind me. Not loud, not demanding, just certain. "Janek?" The sound of it cut through me like a knife, not because it was harsh, but because it was familiar. The way someone says your name not as a question, but as a memory. I turned slowly, afraid that if I moved too quickly, the moment would vanish, dissolve into the wind, like every other dream I'd had. She stood a few feet away, her hands clasped in front of her, a soft floral scarf tied around her head, white hair peeking out beneath it. Her coat was too thin for the chill still lingering in the morning air, but she didn't seem to notice. Her eyes, God, her eyes. They were older, yes, but they were the same. Pale blue, clear, watching me like she'd been searching the whole city just to find this bench, just to find me. I couldn't speak at first. My mouth opened, then closed again, like I was trying to remember how language worked. My hands trembled. I reached into my coat and pulled out the letter slowly, as if it might dissolve in the light. She stepped closer, eyes on the envelope. "I thought you were dead," she said, voice breaking, the words clinging to her throat. I waited. I wrote. I asked. I wanted to ask her how she found me, how she remembered me, how she still knew my name after all these years, but all I managed was, "Helena." She nodded, her eyes filling, but she didn't cry. She sat beside me on the bench, her knees brushing mine, like it was the most natural thing in the world, like no time had passed at all. "I only found out last week," she whispered. "A friend sent me a photo. Said there was a man on a bench, reading the same letter every day. Said he looked like someone I used to know." I looked down at the envelope in my lap, creased, stained, corners rounded by years of handling, and felt shame rise in my throat like bile. "I should have come to you," I said. "I should have knocked. I thought I'd lost the right." She was quiet for a long moment, and I could feel her watching me, not judging, just remembering. And then she reached out and placed her hand over mine. "I kept your letters," she said, "even when they stopped coming. I never changed my number. I moved, yes, but I waited. I married after the war, but he knew. He always knew I never really stopped looking for you." That hit harder than I expected. The idea that somewhere, even after building a new life, a part of her had always been facing backward, toward a younger version of me who hadn't deserved it. I wanted to say so many things, about the war, about shame, about the nights I slept with her name on my tongue and her image behind my eyelids. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I opened the letter one last time and handed it to her. She took it with trembling fingers, unfolded it slowly. Her eyes scanned the page, and I watched her mouth form the words I had memorized so many years ago. Halfway through, she stopped reading aloud and simply held it against her chest, just as I had so many nights alone in the dark. "Why didn't you send it?" she asked softly. "I was afraid you'd moved on. I was afraid I didn't deserve to be remembered." She shook her head, wiped at her eyes with the edge of her scarf. "Janek, being remembered isn't something you earn. It's something you are. You were never gone. Not really. Not from me." We sat there for a long time after that. No dramatic music, no crowds gathering. Just the sound of the river, the faint laughter of children in the distance, and two people rediscovering a version of themselves they thought had died long ago. She didn't ask me to leave with her. I didn't ask her to start over. We just sat, shoulder to shoulder, like two strangers who once meant everything to each other, and maybe still did. Now I sit here, still on the same bench where I spent half a lifetime, but something's changed. I'm not invisible anymore. Not to her, not to myself. The city still moves past me, fast, busy, indifferent, but every now and then she comes back. Helena, with her scarf tied neatly, a paper bag in one hand and tea in the other. She never stays long. She has children now, grandchildren, a life that exists beyond this park, beyond me. But she always brings something warm, bread from a Polish bakery in Greenpoint, a small tin of cherry jam, a thermos of black tea, sweetened just enough to soften the edge of morning air. She doesn't try to fix me, doesn't ask why I never got off the bench. She just sits beside me, talks about the weather, the neighbor's cat, her granddaughter who wants to be a pilot. And then sometimes, when no one's watching, she rests her hand on mine just for a moment. And I remember that once I belonged somewhere, to someone, that even after all the silence, my name still lives in another person's mouth. People still pass us without looking. They see an old man in a fraying coat and an old woman with a kind smile. They don't know what we've carried, what we lost, what we never said, but I've stopped needing their eyes to feel real. I've stopped waiting for explanations. I no longer chase the life that slipped through my fingers. I just let her sit beside me, and that's enough. I still have the letter. I'll never send it, not because it's meaningless, but because it already did what it needed to do. It brought her back to me, even if only for mornings with warm bread and tea, even if only for the quiet space between two sentences where her hand brushes mine and I remember how it felt to be loved without question. She once told me, "You didn't fail me, you just got lost." And maybe that's all any of us are doing, trying not to get lost in a world that moves too fast to remember our names. So I sit here, still, waiting for spring mornings, listening to pigeons argue like old friends, watching dogs chase their tails in circles, just like I chase time. And sometimes someone new will sit beside me, a stranger, a tourist, a mother with a baby stroller, and they'll ask gently, "Do you come here often?" I smile and I answer, yes, this bench has known me longer than anyone else. But now, finally, I'm not alone. And maybe I never really was. We have new videos every day, real stories that touch and inspire. We have new videos every day, real stories that touch and inspire. If this one moved you, leave a comment and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes all it takes is a name to bring someone back.